The Texas plains in the summer of 1879 stretched wide and merciless beneath a sky that forgot what mercy looked like, and the heat rose in waves that bent the horizon until a man couldn't trust his own eyes. In places like this, fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card, and a woman's worth was measured by what men decided was worth nothing more and sometimes considerably less. There were towns scattered across this hard country where the law was whatever the man with the fastest draw said it was, and where promises meant nothing unless you had the strength to enforce them. This is a story about one such town, and what happened when a gambling man finally pushed his luck too far. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Sweetwater sat at the junction of two cattle trails about 60 miles northwest of Fort Worth, where the Brazos River bent south and the land opened into rolling grassland dotted with mesquite and live oak. It wasn't much of a town, just two streets that crossed in the middle, with a general store, a livery stable, a blacksmith shop, and three saloons, all competing for the same tired cowboys and drifters who passed through on their way to somewhere more important. The largest of the saloons was called the Red Queen, and it occupied the corner lot where the main street met the trail road, a two-story structure with a false front painted crimson and gold and windows that glowed amber every night from sunset until dawn. On a Thursday evening in late July, a stranger rode into Sweetwater on a dappled gray mare that looked too fine for the dust-caked rider who sat on her saddle. The horse had good lines and a smooth gait, the kind of animal that cost real money, but the man wore clothes that had seen better days, a black suit gone shiny at the elbows and knees, boots that needed new heels, and a hat with a brim that curled up at the edges from too many rainstorms. He was tall and lean, with the kind of face that seemed carved from angles, sharp cheekbones, a narrow jaw, and pale blue eyes that moved constantly, scanning, assessing, and calculating. His hair was dark blonde, streaked with gray at the temples, and he wore it longer than was fashionable, brushing his collar in the back. A carefully trimmed mustache gave him an air of sophistication that the rest of his appearance contradicted. His name was Thomas Bridger, though he'd used other names in other towns, and he made his living at cards. Not by cheating exactly, though he wasn't above it when circumstances required, but by reading men the way other people read newspapers. He knew when a man was bluffing from the way his breathing changed, or when someone had a winning hand from the tiny muscle that twitched beneath their left eye. He understood greed and fear and pride, and he knew how to use all three to empty a man's pockets while making him think it was his own bad luck and nothing more. Bridger had been working his way west for 6 months now, staying in each town just long enough to win what he could before the local players wised up or got angry enough to do something about it. He'd left Abilene in April after a dispute over marked cards that hadn't actually been marked, and he'd spent May in a little nothing place called Harker's Bend, where he'd won a pocket watch, a saddle, and nearly $300 before the sheriff suggested he might be happier elsewhere. June had been lean, just small games in small towns, and by the time July rolled around, his stake had shrunk to less than $50, and the mare was starting to show her ribs. He needed a game, a real game, with real money and players who thought they were better than they actually were. Sweetwater looked promising. He rode slowly down the main street, noting details the way a scout noted terrain. The general store had fresh paint, which meant money was coming through. The livery had 6 horses in the corral, which meant traffic, and the Red Queen had 2 hitching posts out front, both nearly full, which meant players. He reined in at the saloon, dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose back hurt from too many nights sleeping rough, and tied the mare to the rail. She nickered softly, and he patted her neck once before climbing the 3 steps to the boardwalk. The interior of the Red Queen was what he expected. A long bar ran down the left side, backed by a cloudy mirror and shelves holding bottles of varying quality. Tables filled the center of the room, some for drinking, some for cards, and at the back, a narrow staircase led up to whatever rooms the saloon rented by the hour. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of spilled whiskey and unwashed bodies. A piano sat silent in one corner, and a painting of a woman in red hung behind the bar, her smile knowing and her eyes following whoever looked at her. Bridger moved to the bar. The bartender was a thick-shouldered man with a bald head and suspicious eyes, and he approached slowly, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "Whiskey," Bridger said, "and make it the good kind, not the turpentine you serve the cowboys." The bartender grunted, but reached for a better bottle and poured 2 fingers into a glass. Bridger laid a coin on the bar, and the man took it without comment. He sipped the whiskey slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light and surveying the room. There were perhaps 15 men scattered among the tables. Most were drinking alone or in pairs, but at a table near the back wall, 4 men sat with cards in their hands and chips stacked in front of them. Money changed hands as he watched, and one man laughed loud and harsh, while another cursed and threw his cards down in disgust. That was the table he wanted. He finished his whiskey, ordered another, and carried it toward the back. As he approached, the players looked up with the wary attention of men who knew that strangers sometimes meant trouble. The man who'd been laughing was huge, easily 250 pounds, with a round red face and small dark eyes that glittered with mean intelligence. He wore a leather vest over a sweat-stained shirt, and his hands were thick-fingered and scarred across the knuckles. A holstered revolver hung from his belt, positioned for a cross draw. The second man was older, perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair and a weather-beaten face lined deep around the eyes and mouth. He wore a cattleman's clothes of good quality but worn from use, and he held his cards with the casual confidence of someone who'd been playing poker since before some of the other players were born. The third was younger, mid-20s, with sandy hair and a weak chin. He kept glancing at his chips and then at the other players as if calculating whether he could afford to lose what was already on the table. His clothes marked him as a clerk or shopkeeper, someone who worked indoors and counted other people's money. The fourth man was the one who drew Bridger's attention immediately. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair combed back from a high forehead and a handsome face that would have been striking if not for the slackness around the mouth and the redness in his eyes. He wore expensive clothes, a brocade vest, a silk tie, a coat with silver buttons, but everything was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been wearing it for days without changing. His chips were few and scattered, and as Bridger watched, he shoved the last of them toward the center of the table with the reckless gesture of a man who'd already lost too much and couldn't stop himself from losing more. "Room for another player?" Bridger asked, keeping his voice easy and friendly. The big man looked him up and down. "You got money? Enough." The older cattleman gestured to an empty chair. "Sit then, but the stakes are real. We're not playing for matchsticks." Bridger sat and set his whiskey on the table. The game was a 5-card draw, nothing fancy, and the stakes were indeed real. The pot in front of them held at least $80, and from the looks of things, the handsome man with the expensive vest had contributed most of it. The big man dealt. His name was Harlan Moss, and he owned the Red Queen along with half the property on the north side of town. The cattleman was George Ridgway, who ran cattle on 10,000 acres east of Sweetwater and came to town every week to drink and play cards and remind everyone he was still rich. The nervous young clerk was named Peter Caldwell, and he worked at his father's general store counting inventory and dreaming of somewhere more exciting. And the man in the brocade vest was Elliot Garrett, and he'd been losing steadily for 3 hours. Bridger folded the first hand, watching and learning. Moss played aggressively, betting high and pushing others out of pots through sheer intimidation. Ridgway played conservatively, waiting for good hands and betting carefully. Caldwell played scared, checking when he should have bet, folding when he should have called, and Garrett played like a drowning man, grabbing at anything that floated past, regardless of whether it would actually save him. The second hand, Bridger won with a pair of queens. Nothing spectacular, but enough to take a modest pot. He kept his expression neutral and pulled the chips toward him without comment. The third hand was larger. Garrett opened with a reckless bet, pushing chips forward with shaking hands. Moss called and raised. Ridgway folded with a disgusted shake of his head. Caldwell hesitated, then folded as well. Bridger looked at his cards, a pair of 10s and nothing else. He should have folded, but something in Garrett's eyes made him call. The draw came. Garrett took 2 cards. Moss took 1. Bridger took 3 and caught a third 10. Garrett bet again this time, shoving everything he had left toward the center. Moss studied him for a long moment, then folded with a grunt. It was just Bridger and Garrett now. Bridger called and laid down his 3 10s. Garrett stared at them for a moment, then laid down his own cards. 2 pair jacks and 7s. His face went white, then red, then white again. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward, and for a moment Bridger thought the man might lunge across the table, but instead Garrett turned and walked toward the bar, his movements stiff and jerky. Bridger pulled the pot toward him. Across the table, Moss grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "That's twice you've taken his money," he said. "Careful, he doesn't decide to take it back." "He was the type?" Bridger asked. Moss shrugged. "His daddy owned half of Sweetwater before he drank himself to death. Elliot inherited it all, and he's been working his way through it ever since, mostly at this table." He gestured toward the bar where Garrett was demanding whiskey. "And got a pretty wife, though God knows why she stays." Bridger glanced toward the bar. Garrett had the whiskey bottle now and was pouring with a heavy hand. The bartender watched him with the expression of a man who'd seen this before and knew it wouldn't end well. They played for another hour. Bridger won steadily, but not too much. Moss won some and lost some and seemed content with the evening. Ridgway won a large pot with a full house and stood to leave, announcing he had an early drive in the morning. Caldwell lost his stake and departed, looking relieved to escape with his dignity intact. That left 3 players. Garrett returned to the table with the whiskey bottle in one hand and a wild look in his eyes. He sat heavily and pulled a leather wallet from his coat. Inside were bills worn and creased, and he counted them out onto the table with exaggerated care. $200, maybe a little more. "New stake," he announced, his words slurring together at the edges. "I'm not finished yet," Moss laughed. "You're drunk, Elliot. Go home before you lose that too." "I'm not drunk," Garrett snapped, "and I don't lose. I'm just having a run of bad luck." Bridger said nothing. He organized his chips into neat stacks and waited. Men like Garrett were predictable. They always thought one more hand would change everything, and they never knew when to stop. The next hand was large. Garrett opened aggressively, shoving $50 into the pot. Moss called. Bridger looked at his cards, a pair of aces, and called as well. The draw came, and Garrett stood pat, which meant he either had a very good hand or was bluffing on nothing. Moss took 2 cards, and Bridger took 3, catching nothing. Garrett bet another 50. Moss studied him for a long moment, then folded. Bridger should have folded too. His aces weren't enough to beat a made hand, but something in Garrett's eyes, that desperate brightness, told him the man was bluffing. He called. Garrett's face went through a series of expressions of surprise, then panic, then rage. He laid down his cards. King high, nothing else. Bridger showed his aces and pulled the pot toward him. Garrett stood so fast his chair toppled backward. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, and every conversation died. Men turned to look, and the bartender reached beneath the bar for whatever weapon he kept there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're cheating," Garrett said, his voice loud and ragged. "You have to be cheating." Bridger remained seated. "I'm not," he said evenly. "You're just drunk and playing badly." Liar. Garrett's hand dropped toward his waist, but he wasn't wearing a gun. His fingers closed on empty air, and for a moment he looked confused, as if he couldn't understand why his weapon wasn't there. Moss stood now, and his hand was on his revolver. "Elliot," said, his voice carrying an edge. "Go home. Sleep it off. You're done for tonight." "I'm not done," Garrett shouted. "I can still play. I've got more. I've got the house. I've got property. I'll bet it all. You don't have nothing but debts." Moss said, "Everybody knows you mortgaged the house last winter to pay off what you owed the bank." "That's a lie." Garrett spun toward him, swaying slightly. "I own that house. Clear. My father left it to me." "Your father left you debts," Moss said, "and a wife too good for you. Now go home before I have you thrown out." Garrett's face twisted with rage and humiliation. He turned back to Bridger. "One more hand," he said. "I'll play you one more hand, and the winner takes everything. You've got nothing left to bet, Bridger said quietly. Yes, I do. Garrett's eyes were wild, now unfocused. I've got. He stopped. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of terrible clarity. His mouth opened, then closed. Then it opened again. I've got my wife, he said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sound of breathing seemed to stop. Every man in the Red Queen stared at Elliot Garrett with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to dark anticipation. Bridger leaned back in his chair. You're drunk, he said. Go home. Garrett insisted. I'm offering a wager. You win. You get everything. The house, the land, and her you lose. I get everything you've won tonight. He pointed at the chips and cash piled in front of Bridger, easily $600. Moss stepped forward. Elliot, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Garrett turned to face the room, his voice rising. You're all witnesses. I'm making a legal wager on my wife and property against his winnings, one-hander poker. Who's going to deal? No one moved. The bartender had come around from behind the bar and stood now with a sawed-off shotgun in his hands, but he made no move to intervene. In the corner, two drifters watched with the hungry expressions of men who enjoyed watching other people destroy themselves. Bridger looked at Garrett for a long moment. The man was beyond reason now, beyond shame. He was drowning, and he'd grabbed onto the worst possible lifeline, and he was going to pull everyone down with him if they let him. Slowly, carefully, Bridger gathered his chips and cash and began putting them in his coat pockets. I'm not playing, he said. Garrett's face went purple. Coward, he screamed. You're afraid. I'm not afraid. Bridger stood and pushed his chair back. I just don't take men's wives at cards. It's bad luck. He turned toward the door. Behind him, Garrett made a choking sound, half sob, half laugh. Then Bridger heard the scrape of a chair and boots on the floorboards, moving fast, and someone shouted, "Look out!" But he was already turning, already reaching for the small pistol he carried in a shoulder rig. Garrett hit him like a charging bull. They went down in a tangle of limbs and overturned furniture, and Bridger's head cracked against the edge of a table. Stars exploded across his vision, and for a moment he was somewhere else, somewhere dark, with the sound of gunfire and screaming. Then he was back, and Garrett was on top of him, hands around his throat, squeezing with surprising strength for a drunk man. Bridger couldn't breathe and couldn't think. He clawed at Garrett's hands, but they were locked tight. His vision began to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. He heard shouting and felt hands grabbing, trying to pull Garrett off, but the man held on with the desperate strength of the truly insane. Then suddenly the pressure released. Air flooded back into Bridger's lungs, and he gasped and coughed and rolled onto his side. Through watering eyes, he saw Moss standing over him, and Garrett sprawled on the floor unconscious, blood running from a split in his scalp where Moss had clubbed him with the butt of his revolver. The bartender appeared with a bucket of water and threw it on Garrett's face. The man sputtered and groaned, but didn't wake. Moss gestured, and two of the drifters grabbed Garrett under the arms and dragged him toward the door. "Get him out of here," Moss said, "and tell his wife to come collect him." Bridger got slowly to his feet. His throat felt like it had been crushed, and every breath burned. He retrieved his hat from where it had fallen and brushed the dust from his coat. Moss asked. Bridger nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. He looked toward the door where Garrett had been dragged out into the night. Outside, someone was shouting, and he heard the sound of a woman's voice, sharp with fear and anger. "I should leave," he said. Probably Moss agreed. "But you might want to meet the woman he just tried to trade for a poker pot. She's going to want to know who nearly owned her." Before Bridger could respond, the saloon doors swung open, and she walked in. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, and a face that was striking rather than pretty, all strong lines and intelligent eyes. She wore a plain dark dress, cinched at the waist, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, showing forearms marked with small scars, the kind women got from cooking and cleaning and endless work. She wasn't beautiful in the way painted women or society ladies, but there was something in the set of her shoulders and the directness of her gaze that made Bridger forget to breathe for reasons that had nothing to do with being choked. She crossed the room with quick, purposeful steps and stopped in front of Moss. "Where is he?" she demanded. Outside, Moss said, drunk and bleeding, but alive. She turned, and her eyes found Bridger. "You're the gambler," she said. It wasn't a question. "Thomas Bridger, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment. Her eyes were green, or maybe hazel. It was hard to tell in the lamplight, and they missed nothing. She saw the marks on his throat, saw the way he held himself, saw the chips and cash still scattered across the table. unthinkable. "Did you accept his wager?" she asked. "No, ma'am, I did not." "Why not?" The question caught him off guard. "Because a man doesn't bet his wife," he said finally, "and a decent man doesn't take her." Something flickered in her expression, too fast to read. She nodded once, then turned back to Moss. "I'm taking him home," she said, "and he won't be back, I'll see to that." She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at Bridger. Her face was unreadable, but her voice was steady and clear. "Thank you," she said. Then she was gone. Bridger stood in the silence that followed, aware that every man in the saloon was watching him. He gathered his winnings, counted out the money, and divided the chips into stacks that he could carry. His hands were steady, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the woman's eyes, about the scars on her arms, about the way she'd thanked him for something that should never have required thanks. And he thought about Elliot Garrett, unconscious in the street, and the kind of man who would bet his wife on the turn of a card. The night was cool when he finally stepped outside. The moon hung low and bright over Sweetwater, painting everything silver and shadow. Down the street he could see a lamp burning in one of the houses, and he wondered if that was where she lived, where she would spend tonight cleaning up her drunk husband, and wondering how much longer she could endure. Bridger collected his mare from the hitching post and walked her toward the livery. Behind him, the Red Queen's windows glowed warm, but he didn't look back. Tomorrow he would leave Sweetwater the way he always left, quietly and without goodbyes, with his winnings in his saddlebags and another town waiting somewhere down the trail. But tonight, as he bedded down in the hayloft of the livery stable, he couldn't stop thinking about green eyes and a voice that said thank you, and the terrible weight of gratitude for being treated like a human being instead of property. Somewhere in town a dog barked. The wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of dust and cattle, and the promise of rain that might never come. And Thomas Bridger lay awake staring at the rafters, wondering why he hadn't just ridden past Sweetwater entirely. Morning came to Sweetwater with the slow reluctance of something that knew what the day would bring. The sun rose hot and white over the eastern plains, and by the time Bridger woke in the hayloft, the air already carried the sticky weight of another scorching day. He climbed down from the loft, brushing straw from his clothes, and found the livery owner, a stooped older man with rheumy eyes, already at work, mucking stalls. "Your mare's been fed," the man said without looking up. "Cost you 2 bits for the night and the feed." Bridger paid him and spent the next hour checking the horse's shoes and cleaning his tack with the methodical attention of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on details. The mare was in better shape than she'd been in weeks, thanks to a full night's rest and proper grain, and as he ran his hands down her legs, checking for heat or swelling, she nickered softly and leaned into his touch. He should leave now, pack his gear, saddle up, and point himself toward the next town before whatever had happened last night caught up with him. Men like Elliot Garrett didn't forget humiliation, and drunk or sober, they had ways of making strangers regret staying too long. But something kept him there in the dim coolness of the stable, with his hands on the mare's warm neck. He told himself it was practical, that the horse needed another day's rest, and that riding out in the midday heat would be foolish. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. He wanted to see her again. He was still arguing with himself when footsteps approached the stable door. Bridger's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his hip before he recognized the silhouette. George Ridgway, the cattleman from last night's game, stepped into the shadows and removed his hat. "Thought I might find you here," Ridgway said, his weathered face unreadable. Most men would have cleared out after what happened. Most men would be smart, Bridger replied. Ridgway smiled without humor. He moved to the mare and ran an appraising eye over her. "Fine animal," he said, "too fine for a gambling man on a losing streak." "I haven't been losing." "Not yet, maybe." Ridgway turned to face him directly. "I came to tell you something about Elliot Garrett and his wife. Figure you ought to know before you decide whether to stay or go." Bridger said nothing, but he didn't walk away either. Ridgway leaned against a support beam and pulled out a pipe, which he packed and lit with slow, deliberate movements. "Her name's Margaret," he said. "Margaret Hayes, before she married though most folks call her Maggie. She came to Sweetwater about 4 years back on the stage from San Antonio, had one bag to her name and a letter of introduction to the school teacher position that had just opened up. He paused to draw on the pipe, and smoke wreathed his head in the shaft of sunlight. She was different from most women who came out here. He continued, not running from anything, not looking to get rich, just wanted to teach children their letters. She was good at it, too patient and firm, and by the end of that first year, every child in Sweetwater could read at least a little. Bridger listened quietly. Outside, a wagon rattled past, and somewhere a hammer rang against an anvil in steady rhythm. Elliot Garrett noticed her. Of course, Ridgway said every man in town noticed her, but Elliot had advantages the rest of us didn't. His father had just died and left him the big house on the hill and enough property to make him one of the wealthier men in the county. He was handsome back then, before the drinking got bad, and he could be charming when he wanted to be. He courted her with proper flowers and buggy rides and Sunday dinners with the preacher as chaperone, and she married him, Bridger said. She did. Ridgway's expression darkened 6 months after they met, and stood up in the church with half the town watching, thinking she was getting security and respectability in the future. He drew on the pipe again, and what she got was a man who loved cards and whiskey more than he loved anything else, including her. How bad is it? Bad enough that she doesn't come to town much anymore. Bad enough that when she does, she wears long sleeves even in summer. Ridgway met Bridger's eyes. He's never hit her in public, and she's never said a word against him, but people see things. Bruises that don't come from accidents. The way she flinches when he raises his voice. The fact that she sold her mother's silver last year to pay his gambling debts. Bridger felt something cold settle in his chest. Why doesn't she leave? Where would she go? Ridgway asked her family dead. She's got no money of her own, and Texas law says a woman's property belongs to her husband. She leaves with nothing, and Elliot would probably come after her anyway. Pride, if nothing else. The stable fell quiet except for the sound of the mare shifting in her stall and the distant hammer still ringing. Bridger thought about the woman from last night, the strength in her voice when she'd thanked him, and the weight of resignation beneath it. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Ridgway knocked ash from his pipe. "Because last night in the Red Queen, I saw something I haven't seen in Maggie Garrett's face in 3 years," he said. "Hope, just for a moment. When you refused that obscene wager, I saw her realize that not every man in the world thinks of women as property to be traded." He replaced his hat and turned toward the door. "And because you're a stranger here, which means you don't owe anybody anything. You could ride out and forget all this, or you could stay and maybe do some good." "What kind of good?" "That's for you to figure." Ridgway paused at the threshold. "One more thing Elliot's been talking about this morning, making threats, said you cheated him, said you attacked him, said a lot of things that aren't true. Harlan Moss set him straight, but Elliot's got friends, or at least he's got men who owe him money, and some of them are the type to act first and think later," noted, Bridger said. Ridgway nodded and left. The sound of his boots faded down the street, and Bridger was alone again with the mare and his thoughts, and the growing certainty that he'd already made his decision, even if he didn't want to admit it yet. He spent the rest of the morning walking Sweetwater, learning its rhythms and spaces. The town was laid out simply as most frontier towns were, with the main street running east-west and smaller lanes branching off to the north and south. The residential area, such as it was, occupied the southern quarter, modest houses with kitchen gardens and chicken coops and children playing in the dust. The Garrett house sat apart from the others on a low rise at the edge of town, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and windows that caught the morning light. Bridger didn't approach it. He walked past on the far side of the street, keeping his eyes forward but aware of every detail. The paint was peeling on the north wall. The porch steps sagged in the middle. The garden that must have once been maintained had gone to weeds, and the fence around it leaned at drunken angles. A woman worked in that garden, now kneeling in the dirt with a basket beside her. Even from a distance, he recognized Margaret Garrett by the way she moved efficiently, without wasted motion, pulling weeds and setting them aside. She wore a faded blue dress and a wide-brimmed hat, and her sleeves were rolled down despite the heat. He kept walking. The general store occupied the corner where the main street met the north road, and Bridger went inside, looking for supplies. The interior was cool and dim and smelled of burlap and coffee and dried apples. Behind the counter stood a young man he recognized as Peter Caldwell from last night's game. "Morning, Caldwell," said his voice nervously. "Help you find something? Coffee beans," Bridger said, "and jerky if you've got it." Caldwell assembled the items with quick movements, his hands shaking slightly. When he named the price, Bridger paid without haggling and accepted the wrapped packages. He was turning to leave when Caldwell spoke again. "Mr. Bridger." He turned back. Caldwell glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "What you did last night, refusing that wager, it was the right thing. Wasn't much of a choice. Some men would have taken it." Caldwell's young face was earnest, troubled. "Some men would have thought they were entitled." He hesitated, then continued. "Mrs. Garrett's a good woman. She doesn't deserve what she's gotten." "No woman does," Bridger said. He left the store and stood on the boardwalk watching the street. A stagecoach rattled past, heading east, trailing dust, and the driver raised a hand in casual greeting. 3 cowboys emerged from the Red Queen, squinting against the bright light, and mounted horses tied to the rail. Normal traffic for a normal day, except nothing about this felt normal. Bridger returned to the livery and found Harlan Moss waiting for him. The big man sat on a barrel near the stable entrance, his coat pulled back to show the revolver on his hip, and his expression somewhere between amused and annoyed. "Wondered when you'd show up," Moss said. "Something you need?" "Maybe." Moss stood, and his considerable bulk seemed to fill the space. "I've been thinking about last night, about Elliot's offer and your refusal, and what it all means. And what does it mean?" Moss studied him carefully. "Which means you're either a fool or a decent man, and decent men are almost as dangerous as fools in a place like this." He moved closer. "Planning to stick around Sweetwater, Mr. Bridger?" "Haven't decided." "Well, decide quick, because Elliot's been drinking since dawn and talking about how you humiliated him." Moss's voice dropped. "Got 3 men with him now, Jake Turner and the Dobbs brothers, and they're working themselves up to doing something stupid. Turner and Dobbs, those names mean something to me. Should. Jake Turner killed 2 men, both in fair fights technically, and the Dobbs brothers aren't particularly fair." Moss crossed his arms. "And they're loyal to Elliot, because he pays their tabs at the Red Queen, and because they're the kind of men who enjoy having an excuse to hurt someone." Bridger absorbed this. "Appreciate the warning," he said. "Don't appreciate it too much." "I'm not doing it for you." Moss's expression hardened. "I'm doing it because Maggie Garrett deserves better than to watch another man get killed over her husband's stupidity. She's been through enough." "Agreed. So if you're smart, you'll ride out before sundown." Moss turned to leave, then paused. "And if you're not smart, if you decide to stay, then you watch your back. Elliot and his friends won't come at you straight. They'll wait until you're alone or distracted, and then it'll be 4 against 1, and they won't play fair." "Noted." Moss left without another word, and Bridger stood in the stable, feeling the weight of accumulated warnings pressing down on him. Every sensible instinct screamed at him to saddle the mare and go. He didn't owe these people anything. Margaret Garrett's troubles weren't his, and getting involved would only complicate his life and possibly end it. But he thought about her face when she walked into the Red Queen last night, the shame and fury and terrible resignation, the way she'd thanked him for basic human decency, as if it were some rare and precious gift. And he thought about Elliot Garrett's hands around his throat and the wild desperation in the man's eyes. Something was going to break here in Sweetwater, soon, and when it did, Margaret Garrett would be in the middle of it. The question was whether Bridger would still be around to do anything about it. He was still debating when afternoon shadows began to stretch across the stable floor, and footsteps approached again. This time he recognized them, lighter, quicker, and when Margaret Garrett appeared in the doorway, he wasn't surprised. She looked different in daylight somehow, despite the lines of strain around her eyes. She'd changed into a clean dress and pinned her hair up, and she carried a covered basket in both hands. "Mr. Bridger," said, her voice steady. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." She set the basket on a barrel. "I brought you something she said payment for last night. Though I know nothing could truly repay what you did, you don't owe me anything. I owe you everything." Her eyes met his and held. "You refused a wager that would have ruined us both, you and me. Most men wouldn't have. Most men aren't decent." "No, they're not." She moved closer and he caught the scent of soap and sunlight that clung to her. "You've been warned about my husband, haven't you? About what he might do." "I have. And you're still here. It was a statement, not a question, and Bridger found he had no answer that didn't sound either foolish or presumptuous. He said nothing. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slightly. "I married Elliot 4 years ago," she said quietly. "I thought I knew what I was getting. A successful man, a good provider, someone who wanted a partner, not just a housekeeper." Her voice was matter-of-fact, almost clinical. "I was wrong on every count. Mrs. Garrett, please," she interrupted to let me finish. "I need to say this to someone who isn't Elliot and isn't one of the women in town who pity me but won't help." She took a breath. "My husband is a drunk and a gambler and a coward who takes his failures out on me because I can't fight back. He's lost most of what his father built, and what's left is mortgaged or promised to men who will come collect eventually. And last night he tried to trade me, like I was livestock or furniture. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry." Her voice hardened, "just to understand that when he comes for you, and he will come, it won't be fair, and it won't be honorable. He'll bring his friends, and they'll try to hurt you badly enough that you leave, or badly enough that you can't. I can handle myself. I hope so." She picked up the basket again and held it out inside. "You'll find bread and cold chicken and a bottle of decent whiskey. And if you're wise, you'll use the next few hours to get as far from Sweetwater as you can. And if I don't, then God help you, Mr. Bridger." She turned toward the door, paused, and looked back one more time, and "Thank you again for being the kind of man who thinks women are people." Then she was gone, leaving only the basket and the fading scent of soap and the echo of her words hanging in the still air. Bridger stood alone in the gathering shadows and made his decision. He wasn't leaving. The afternoon heat pressed down on Sweetwater like a physical weight, turning the air thick and still until even breathing felt like work. Bridger sat in the shade of the livery's overhang with his back against the wall and his hat pulled low, watching the street through half-closed eyes. To anyone passing, he looked like just another drifter dozing away the hottest part of the day. But his right hand rested casual on his thigh, inches from the pistol hidden beneath his coat, and his attention never wavered from the flow of traffic. He'd opened Margaret's basket and found exactly what she'd promised, along with a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the bread. The note was brief and written in a careful schoolteacher's hand. "The Dobbs brothers wear matching red kerchiefs. Jake Turner has a scar across his left eyebrow. They drink at the Red Queen every afternoon. Be careful." Bridger committed the details to memory, then burned the paper in the stable's forge, watching it curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. Information was currency in situations like this, and the fact that Margaret had risked giving it to him told him more about her desperation than any words could have. The street stayed quiet through the worst of the heat. A few women emerged from houses carrying laundry baskets or marketing bags, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm. But most sensible people stayed indoors, waiting for the sun to lose some of its fury. Bridger ate the chickens slowly, savoring each bite, and washed it down with water from his canteen, saving the whiskey for later or never. Around 4 o'clock, the character of the town began to shift. Cowboys rode in from surrounding ranches, their horses streaked with sweat and dust. The saloons opened their doors wide to catch any breeze, and piano music drifted out, tinny and slightly off-key. Men gathered in small groups on the boardwalks, talking low and glancing toward the livery where Bridger sat, and he knew without being told that word had spread about last night's confrontation. He also knew that Elliot Garrett would make his move soon. Men like that couldn't tolerate public humiliation, and the longer Bridger stayed in Sweetwater, the more his mere presence became an insult that demanded response. The only question was when and where and how many men Garrett would bring with him. The answer came sooner than expected. Just past 5 o'clock, as the sun started its slow descent toward the western hills, 4 men emerged from the Red Queen and stood on the boardwalk in a loose line, staring directly at the livery. Even at this distance, Bridger recognized Elliot Garrett by his expensive clothes, now rumpled and stained, and by the unsteady way he held himself. The 3 men flanking him were cut from different cloth. 2 were clearly brothers, both short and stocky, with barrel chests and arms thick from hard labor. They wore identical red kerchiefs tied around their necks, and their faces had the flat, brutal look of men who'd learned early that violence solved most problems. The Dobbs brothers, then. The third man was taller and leaner, with a predatory stillness that marked him as genuinely dangerous. A pale scar cut across his left eyebrow, giving him a permanently skeptical expression, and he wore his gun tied down low on his right hip, the way men did when they expected to draw it fast and often. Jake Turner. They didn't cross the street immediately. Instead, they stood there, letting their presence register, letting the tension build. Other men on the street noticed and began moving away, clearing the line of sight between the saloon and the livery. Windows closed, doors shut, the piano music stopped. Bridger rose slowly and stepped out of the shade into the dusty street. He left his coat open so the pistol showed, and he positioned himself with the sun at his back, forcing the four men to squint if they looked directly at him. Small advantages, but in situations like this, small advantages sometimes made the difference between living and dying. Garrett stepped off the boardwalk first. His movements were exaggerated, theatrical, and Bridger could see he was drunk, but not as drunk as he was pretending. This was performance as much as confrontation, as a way for Garrett to save face while his hired muscle did the actual work. "You're still here," Garrett called, his voice carrying across the empty street. "Thought you'd have run by now." Bridger said nothing. "That's right, stay quiet." Garrett moved closer, and the three men spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle. "You cheated me last night. Everyone knows it marked cards or signals or some other trick." "I played straight," Bridger said quietly. "And you lost because you were drunk and stupid." Garrett's face flushed dark red. "Liar," he spat. "You're a cheat and a coward, and I'm giving you one chance to return what you stole and leave this town before things get ugly." "I didn't steal anything." Bridger's voice remained level, calm. "I won it fair and square, and you know it." "The hell you did." Garrett turned to Jake Turner, who'd been watching the exchange with cold calculation. "Show him what we do to cheats in Sweetwater." Turner smiled without warmth. His hand drifted toward his gun, but he didn't draw, just rested his palm on the grip in casual warning. "You hear the man say you've been asked polite to leave. Now I'm telling you not so. Polite? Get on your horse and ride, or we'll bury you in the town cemetery with the other drifters who didn't know when to move on." Bridger assessed the situation rapidly. 4 against 1, terrible odds. Turner was fast. Probably faster than Bridger. The Dobbs brothers were brawlers who'd rush him if shooting started. Garrett was unpredictable, drunk enough to do something foolish, but not so drunk he couldn't pull a trigger. The smart play was to back down, apologize, maybe return some of the winnings, and ride out with his life intact. But smart plays didn't always sit right with a man's conscience. "No," Bridger said. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Ripples of shock spread across the faces of the watching men, and even Turner looked momentarily surprised. "No," Garrett repeated as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. "No," Bridger repeated. "I won that money fair, and I'm keeping it, and I'm not leaving until I'm ready to leave." Garrett's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then he lunged forward, one hand swinging wild toward Bridger's face. Bridger sidestepped easily, and Garrett stumbled past him, falling to one knee in the dust. The watching crowd murmured, and someone laughed, quickly stifled. That laugh was the breaking point. Garrett surged to his feet, his face contorted with rage and humiliation, and this time when his hand moved, it came up holding a small derringer that had been concealed in his vest. The crowd scattered, shouting warnings, and Bridger's hand dropped to his own gun, but before either man could fire a shot, cracked out from somewhere to the left. Garrett's derringer spun from his hand, sending up a puff of dust where it landed. He yelped and clutched his hand, which showed a red graze across the knuckles, but no serious damage. Everyone froze, turning toward the source of the shot. George Ridgway stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, a smoking rifle held loose in his hands. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his voice carried clear authority. "That's enough, Elliot," he said. "Lower the temperature before someone gets killed." "This isn't your concern," George Garrett shouted, cradling his injured hand. "It is when you're about to commit murder in the middle of town." Ridgway worked the rifle's lever, chambering another round. "I've known you since you were a boy, and I knew your father, and he'd be ashamed to see what you've become. Go home, sleep it off, and maybe tomorrow you'll remember how to act like a man instead of a rabid dog. Jake Turner's hand was still on his gun, and his eyes flicked between Ridgway and Bridger, calculating odds. The Dobbs brothers looked to Garrett for direction, but their boss was staring at his bleeding hand with an expression somewhere between shock and childish betrayal. The standoff held for long seconds. Then Harlan Moss emerged from the Red Queen with a shotgun cradled in his arms and positioned himself beside Ridgway. "George is right," Moss said, his deep voice calm, "but unyielding. This ends now before it gets out of hand. Elliot, you and your boys go home. Jake, you know better than to draw on two men with rifles already aimed at you, and the Dobbs brothers would probably survive about 3 seconds in a real fight, so don't test it." Turner's jaw tightened, but slowly, very slowly, he lifted his hand away from his gun. "Smart man," Moss said. "Now all 4 of you walk away, and we'll pretend this was just some drunk talk that got out of hand." "This isn't over," Garrett hissed, pointing at Bridger with his good hand. "You hear me? This isn't finished." "Yes, it is," Ridgway said. "Unless you want to spend the next month in jail for attempted murder, now go." Garrett spat in the dust, then turned and stalked back toward the saloon. Turner followed with the predatory grace of a wolf forced to retreat, and the Dobbs brothers trailed behind, looking disappointed that they hadn't gotten to hurt anyone. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, talking in low, excited voices about what they'd witnessed. Bridger holstered his pistol, which he didn't even remember drawing, and walked over to where Ridgway and Moss stood. "Much obliged," he said. "Don't thank me yet," Ridgway replied. "You just made enemies of 4 men who won't forget this, and next time they won't try it in broad daylight, where witnesses can interfere." "He's right," Moss added. "They'll wait until you're alone, probably after dark, and then it'll be quick and permanent." His eyes held Bridger's. "You've got maybe until midnight to get gone. After that, you're living on borrowed time." "Noted," Bridger said again. Ridgway lowered his rifle and studied Bridger's face. "You're not leaving, are you?" he said. "Not yet, damn fool." But Ridgway's tone held more resignation than anger. He glanced at Moss. "Why do the decent ones always have to be stubborn? Beats me." Moss replied then to Bridger, "If you're staying, you need to be smart about it. Don't walk dark streets alone. Don't drink anything you didn't pour yourself, and sleep with one eye open because they will come for you. Understood?" "One more thing," Moss said with his expression serious. "Maggie Garrett came to see you this afternoon, didn't she?" It wasn't really a question, but Bridger nodded anyway. "Thought so." Moss shifted the shotgun to his other arm, which means Elliot knows too. Someone would have seen her and told him. He paused, letting that sink in. So now he's not just angry about the card game, or his pride. He's convinced you're trying to take his wife, and that makes this personal in a way that's going to end badly for someone. "I'm not trying to take anyone's wife. Doesn't matter what you're trying, matters what Elliot believes." Ridgway shook his head. "You should have left this morning, when you had the chance. Now you're in the middle of something that's been building for years, and it's going to break soon and break hard." "What do you mean, building for years?" The 2 older men exchanged glances. Finally, Moss spoke. "Elliot's father was a hard man," he said, made his money in freight and cattle, and he ruled this town like his personal kingdom. When he died 5 years ago, everyone expected Elliot to step up and be the same, but Elliot didn't have his father's strength or discipline. He had the money and the property and the name, but not the spine. So he tried to buy respect with card games and drinks for everyone. Ridgway continued. When that didn't work, he married Maggie, thinking a good woman would fix what was broken in him. But you can't fix a man who doesn't want to be fixed. And now, Bridger said slowly, he's lost most of the money and the respect, and the only thing he has left is his wife, and he thinks I'm trying to take her too." "Exactly." Moss's expression was grim, which means he'll do anything to stop that from happening, even if it means killing you or her or both. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Bridger thought about Margaret kneeling in her garden with her sleeves rolled down to hide bruises. Thought about her careful note warning him about the Dobbs brothers and Jake Turner. Thought about the way she'd thanked him for basic human decency. "She's in danger, isn't she?" He said, "Not from me, but from him." "She's been in danger for years," Ridgway said quietly. "We've all known it, but there's nothing we can do. She's his wife legally, and unless she asks for help, or he does something public enough to warrant arrest, our hands are tied. What if he does something tonight? Then we'll deal with it." Moss met Bridger's eyes. "But we can't watch the Garrett house every hour, and we can't arrest a man for what he might do. The best we can offer is to keep an eye on things and step in if it gets loud enough for neighbors to hear." "That's not good enough," Bridger said. "No, it's not." Ridgway's voice was tired and bitter. "But it's all we've got. Welcome to frontier justice, Mr. Bridger. where the law is thin and men like Elliot Garrett can terrorize their wives as long as they do it quietly. The three men stood in the fading light, and around them, Sweetwater returned to its evening rhythms. Lamps flickered on in windows. The smell of cooking fires drifted through the air. Somewhere a child laughed, and a dog barked, and life continued with the stubborn persistence of things that refuse to acknowledge the darkness gathering at the edges. Bridger made his decision then, with the certainty of a man who'd been running too long and finally found a reason to stop. "I'm going to check on her," he said. "Bad idea," Moss said immediately. "If Elliot sees you near his house, then I'll make sure he doesn't see me." Bridger turned toward the livery. "He's at the Red Queen drinking, which means she's home alone. And if he's as angry as you say he is, then when he does go home tonight, it's going to be ugly." "And what exactly do you think you can do about it?" Ridgway asked. "I don't know yet." Bridger glanced back at the two men. "But I know I can't stand here and do nothing." He walked away before they could argue further, and behind him he heard Moss mutter something about fools and lost causes, but neither man tried to stop him. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple, and in the gathering dusk, Thomas Bridger prepared to do something either very brave or very stupid, and he wasn't entirely sure which. Darkness came to Sweetwater with the swiftness of a curtain falling, and with it came a cooling breeze that carried the scent of sage and distant rain that would probably never arrive. Bridger waited until full night had settled over the town before making his move, watching from the livery as lamps winked on in windows and the sounds of evening life drifted through the streets. Children called in for supper. A woman sang something soft and mournful. From the Red Queen came the tinny sound of that off-key piano and the rough laughter of men determined to drink away whatever daylight had shown them about their lives. He'd spent the last hour preparing, checking his pistol and the small backup knife he kept in his boot, gathering supplies he might need, and most importantly, studying the approaches to the Garrett house. The building sat on its hill like a monument to faded prosperity, close enough to town that you could walk there in 10 minutes, but far enough removed that screams might not carry depending on the wind. A copse of cottonwood trees marked the eastern boundary of the property, and a dry creek bed curved around the north side, offering cover for anyone who wanted to approach unseen. Bridger chose the creek bed. He moved through the darkness with the careful quiet of a man who'd scouted hostile territory and knew that a single careless sound could mean the difference between mission accomplished and early grave. The moon was a thin crescent, offering just enough light to navigate by, and the stars hung brilliant and cold overhead, indifferent to human drama. The Garrett house showed lamplight in 2 windows, one downstairs and one up. As Bridger drew closer, staying low in the creek bed, he could see movement behind the downstairs curtains, a shadow passing back and forth with the regular rhythm of someone engaged in domestic work. Margaret washing dishes or preparing something for tomorrow, or simply moving because stillness meant thinking and thinking meant acknowledging the reality of her situation. He settled into a position behind a fallen cottonwood trunk where he had clear sight lines to both the front door and the path leading back toward town. From here, he could see anyone approaching, and more importantly, he could hear what happened inside if things went wrong. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing, and right now nothing was the alternative he refused to accept. The night deepened. The lamp in the upstairs window went dark after about 20 minutes, but the downstairs light remained. Bridger shifted position, trying to find comfort on the hard ground, and failed. His back ached from the long ride, and the earlier scuffle and the cut on his throat where Garrett had choked him throbbed with steady insistence. He ignored all of it the way he'd learned to ignore discomfort during his years as a cavalry scout, and focused on the house. Time moved strangely when you were watching and waiting. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours and hours compressed into moments. Bridger found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him here to this creek bed outside a stranger's house, in a town he'd never heard of until yesterday. He could have ridden past Sweetwater entirely, could have refused to play cards at the Red Queen, could have accepted Garrett's obscene wager and claimed his winnings and moved on without looking back. But he hadn't, and now here he was, and the strange thing was he didn't regret it. Something about Margaret Garrett, her strength in the face of casual cruelty, her refusal to pretend everything was fine, had reached past his carefully maintained defenses and reminded him that some things mattered more than survival. Some things were worth the risk. Around 10 o'clock by his pocket watch, the downstairs lamp finally went dark. The house sat in darkness for perhaps half an hour, and Bridger was beginning to think that maybe tonight would pass without incident when he heard voices coming up the path from town. He pressed himself flat against the fallen tree and watched. 4 figures emerged from the darkness, moving with the exaggerated care of drunk men trying to appear sober. Even at this distance, he recognized Elliot Garrett stumbling slightly with Jake Turner on one side, and the Dobbs brothers flanking them like guards escorting a prisoner. They were talking loud enough for sound to carry, but not loud enough for words to be clear. They stopped at the front gate, and there was a brief discussion. Turner gestured back toward town, and one of the Dobbs brothers shook his head. Garrett swayed and pointed at his house, his voice rising sharp with anger. More discussion, then Turner gripped Garrett's shoulder and leaned close, saying something that made the other man laugh ugly and harsh. Finally, Turner and the Dobbs brothers turned back toward town, leaving Garrett alone at his gate. He stood there for a long moment, staring at his dark house, and even from this distance, Bridger could see the tension in his shoulders, the coiled readiness of a man working himself up to something. Then Garrett pushed through the gate and walked up the path to his front door with steps that were steadier than they'd been a moment ago. The door opened, closed. A lamp flared to life downstairs, and Bridger heard Margaret's voice, muffled by walls but clearly audible in the quiet night. "Where have you been? Where do you think?" Garrett's reply was loud, slurred, playing up the drunk act. "I've been at the Red Queen having a drink with friends, which is more than I can do at home." "You've had more than one drink? Don't start with me, woman. I'm in no mood." Their voices faded as they moved deeper into the house, and Bridger shifted position, trying to find an angle where he could hear better. He was acutely aware that what he was doing, eavesdropping on a private domestic argument, was both intrusive and possibly illegal, but he also knew that George Ridgway's words had been true. By the time neighbors heard something worth reporting, it might already be too late. For several minutes he heard nothing but indistinct murmuring. Then Margaret's voice rose sharp and clear. "I won't do it, Elliot. You can't ask me to. I'm not asking, I'm telling." Garrett's voice had lost its slurred quality, became cold and focused. "You're going to that gambler tomorrow, and you're going to tell him you made a mistake. Tell him you're sorry for causing trouble. Tell him whatever you need to tell him to make him give back what he won. He won it fairly, you know he did. I don't know anything except that you were awful quick to defend him." Garrett's voice rose. "When you went to see him this afternoon, don't deny Martha Hendricks saw you walking to the livery with a basket. I brought him food to thank him for. For what? For humiliating me in front of the whole town, for making me look like a fool, for refusing to take what I offered. You offered me Elliot?" Margaret's voice shook with suppressed fury. "You tried to trade me like I was livestock. You're my wife, which means you're mine to do with as I please." A crash followed the words, something thrown or knocked over, and Bridger's hand moved to his pistol. "You seem to forget that everything you have, everything you are, exists because I allow it." "I haven't forgotten." Margaret's voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "I'm reminded every single day." "Good. Then tomorrow you'll do what I told you, and you'll make that gambler give back my money and my pride. And if you do it right, if you're sweet to him, maybe he'll even pay extra for the privilege." The implication hit Bridger like a physical blow. Garrett wasn't just asking his wife to apologize. He was suggesting she prostitute herself to reclaim his gambling losses. The sheer casual cruelty of it, and the complete lack of regard for her humanity, made something cold and dark unfurl in Bridger's chest. Inside the house, Margaret said something too quiet to hear. Then Garrett's voice came loud and vicious. "Don't you dare walk away from me." Another crash, louder this time, followed by a sharp cry. Bridger was moving before he'd consciously decided to move, rising from his hiding place and crossing the yard in long, silent strides. He reached the front door just as he heard Margaret scream, not loud or long, just a short, sharp sound of pain and fear. He tried the door. Locked. Without hesitation, he stepped back and drove his boot into the wood just beside the handle. The lock was old and the frame was weak, and it gave on the second kick, splintering inward with a crack like a gunshot. Bridger burst into the house, pistol drawn and his eyes adjusting rapidly to the lamplight. The parlor was to his right furnished with pieces that had once been expensive, but now showed signs of neglect. Straight ahead, a hallway led deeper into the house, and from there came the sounds of struggle. He moved fast down the hall and through a doorway into what had once been a formal dining room. The table was shoved against one wall, and chairs lay scattered like someone had thrown them. Margaret stood pressed against the far wall with blood running from her nose, and Garrett had her by the throat with one hand, while the other was drawn back in a fist. Time seemed to slow. Bridger saw Garrett's eyes go wide with shock, then narrow with rage, saw Margaret's expression shift from terror to desperate hope, saw Garrett's fist start to move forward toward Margaret's face. Bridger crossed the room in 3 strides and hit Garrett with his shoulder, driving him away from Margaret and into the wall. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, and Garrett's head cracked against the baseboard with a sound like an egg breaking. He went limp immediately. Bridger rolled off him, breathing hard, and looked up at Margaret. She'd slid down the wall and sat now with her knees drawn up, one hand pressed to her bleeding nose. Her eyes were huge and dark in her pale face. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. "I don't know what," she whispered. Bridger rose and checked Garrett. The man was unconscious but breathing, and when Bridger lifted his eyelids, the pupils responded to light. Concussion probably, but nothing immediately life-threatening. He turned back to Margaret and helped her to her feet. "Let me see," he said gently. She lowered her hand and he examined her nose. Not broken, but it would bruise badly, and her upper lip was split. Her throat showed red marks where Garrett's fingers had pressed, and when Bridger's eyes dropped to her arms, he saw older bruises in various stages of healing. "How long?" he asked quietly. Margaret understood the question. 2 years later, she said, "Maybe longer. I stopped keeping track." "Why didn't you leave?" She laughed at the sound like breaking glass. "Where would I go? I have no money, no family, and no way to support myself. The law says I'm his property, and even if I ran, he'd come after me." She met Bridger's eyes. "You don't understand what it's like to be trapped." "No, I suppose I don't." Bridger glanced at Garrett's unconscious form. "But I understand that you can't stay here, not tonight, and maybe not ever." "What are you suggesting?" "I don't know yet." He thought rapidly, trying to work through options that all seemed equally impossible. "You could go to George Ridgway. He seems like a decent man, or Harlan Moss. They both stood up for you this afternoon. And tell them that my husband hit me." Margaret's voice was bitter. "They already know everyone knows, but knowing and doing something about it are different things. Texas law gives a man the right to discipline his wife as he sees fit, and unless he kills me, there's nothing anyone can do. There has to be something. There isn't." She wiped blood from her face with the back of her hand. "This is my life, Mr. Bridger, and you're breaking down my door and knocking out my husband doesn't change that. When he wakes up, he'll be even angrier, and I'll pay for tonight in ways you can't imagine. Then come with me now." The words were out before Bridger had fully thought them through. "We'll take my horse and ride to Fort Worth or San Antonio or anywhere that isn't here, and you can start over." Margaret stared at him. With what money, she asked, with what prospects? "I'm a woman alone with no references, no skills except teaching, and even if I found work, Elliot would track me down eventually." She shook her head. "Thank you for the offer, but running only delays the inevitable. So what then? You just accept this? What choice do I have?" Before Bridger could answer, Garrett groaned and stirred. Both of them tensed, watching as he rolled onto his side and pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. Blood trickled from a cut on his scalp where he'd hit the wall, and his eyes, when they opened, were unfocused and confused. Then they found Bridger, and clarity returned, along with murderous rage. "You," Garrett spat through bloody teeth. "You broke into my house. You attacked me. I stopped you from beating your wife. There's a difference. Get out." Garrett tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him, and he collapsed back to his knees. "Get out of my house before I have the sheriff arrest you for assault and trespassing," Bridger said quietly. "I'll tell him what I saw. Your word against mine, and you're just a drifting gambler, while I'm a property owner and a citizen." Garrett's smile was ugly, triumphant. "Nobody's going to believe you over me." The terrible thing was, he was probably right. Bridger looked at Margaret and saw resignation in her face, the weary acceptance of someone who'd fought this battle before and lost. He wanted to argue and insist there had to be a way, but he was a stranger here with no authority and no standing, and breaking down a man's door and hitting him, no matter how justified, didn't give him the moral high ground in the eyes of the law. Margaret stepped forward, and her voice was steady. "He's right, Mr. Bridger. You should go. I can't just leave you here with him." "Yes, you can." She met his eyes, and something passed between them, an understanding of futility and the limits of heroism. "I'll be fine. I've survived worse." "That's not, please." The word was soft but firm. "Just go and forget you ever came to Sweetwater. It's better for both of us." Bridger stood frozen, torn between every instinct that screamed at him to take her out of there by force if necessary, and the cold logic that told him doing so would only make things worse. Finally, reluctantly, he nodded. He backed toward the door, keeping his eyes on Garrett, who watched him with hatred burning in his gaze. When he reached the hallway, he paused and looked back at Margaret. "If you need me," he said, "I'll be at the livery." She didn't answer, just stood there with blood on her face and defeat in her shoulders, and Bridger felt something break inside him that he hadn't known was still whole. He left through the broken door and crossed the yard to the creek bed. Behind him, the Garrett house sat with its single lamp still burning and its broken door swinging slightly in the breeze. Bridger stood in the darkness for a long moment, listening for sounds of renewed violence, but heard nothing. The walk back to town felt longer than it should have. By the time he reached the livery, his hands were shaking with suppressed rage and frustration and the terrible impotence of wanting to fix something that was fundamentally broken. He climbed to the hayloft and lay in the darkness, staring at nothing. Somewhere in Sweetwater, a woman was trapped in a nightmare with no escape, and he'd just walked away and left her there. The knowledge sat in his gut like poison, and when he finally slept near dawn, his dreams were dark and full of screaming. Dawn broke grey and reluctant over Sweetwater, as if the sun itself had reservations about illuminating what the new day might bring. Bridger woke with his muscles stiff and his mind already racing through scenarios and possibilities, none of them good. He'd slept perhaps 2 hours total, and those had been fitful, plagued by images of Margaret's bruised face and Garrett's triumphant sneer. The hayloft was cold despite the season, and when he climbed down the ladder, his breath misted in the early morning air. The livery owner wasn't around yet, which suited Bridger fine. He needed time to think without interruption, without well-meaning advice from men who'd already made it clear they thought he was a fool for staying. He fed and watered the mare, speaking to her in low tones while his hands worked automatically, and his brain wrestled with the central problem that had kept him awake all night. Margaret Garrett was trapped legally, morally, practically trapped in every way that mattered. Texas law in 1879 gave husbands near absolute authority over their wives. A woman couldn't own property in her own name, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't even claim legal custody of her own children in a divorce. The law treated wives as extensions of their husbands, as property to be managed rather than people with rights. And while public opinion might frown on a man who beat his wife too openly or too severely, that disapproval rarely translated into action. Bridger had seen similar situations during his army years. Officers' wives with bruises they explained away, enlisted men's families living in fear behind closed doors, and always the same response from the chain of command: domestic matters were private concerns, and unless someone died, the military wouldn't interfere. He'd hated it then, and he hated it now, but understanding the injustice didn't give him a solution. He was still brooding when footsteps approached the stable. Bridger's hand moved toward his pistol before he recognized Peter Caldwell's nervous gait. The young clerk carried a covered basket, and his face showed the strain of a man who hadn't slept well either. "Mr. Bridger," Caldwell said, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I brought breakfast. My mother insisted when I told her what happened last night." "What did you tell her exactly?" "Just that there was trouble at the Garrett place, and you were involved." Caldwell set the basket on a barrel. "Words all over town that you broke into their house and attacked Elliot while he was sleeping." "That's not what happened." "I know." Caldwell met his eyes. "I also know that Maggie had a split lip and a black eye this morning when she came to the store for supplies, and that she jumped like a startled rabbit when I asked if she was all right." His jaw tightened. "My mother says Elliot's been knocking her around for years, but nobody does anything because it's legal and because Elliot still has enough money to make trouble for anyone who crosses him." Bridger absorbed this. "The food smells good," he said. "Tell your mother thanks." "I will." Caldwell hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "There's something else. Jake Turner was in the store earlier buying ammunition. He said Elliot's planning something for tonight, said they're going to teach you a lesson about interfering in other men's business." "How many of them?" "Turner and the Dobbs brothers, at least, maybe others, if Elliot can convince convince them there's something in it for them? Caldwell's voice dropped to a whisper. You need to leave, Mr. Bridger, today before dark, because if you're still here when the sun goes down, they'll come for you, and they won't give you a chance to draw. Noted. That's all you have to say. Caldwell looked bewildered. Aren't you frightened? Terrified, Bridger said honestly, but leaving doesn't solve anything. It solves you staying alive, maybe. Bridger turned to face the young man fully. But it doesn't solve Margaret Garrett's problem. And right now that seems more important than my safety. Caldwell stared at him as if he'd announced plans to sprout wings and fly. You're going to get yourself killed over a woman who isn't even yours, he said. She's not anyone's, Bridger replied. That's the whole point. After Caldwell left, muttering about noble idiots, Bridger ate the breakfast biscuits and bacon and strong coffee, then sat on a hay bale and forced himself to think strategically. The immediate problem was surviving the night. The larger problem was finding a way to extract Margaret from her situation that didn't involve kidnapping, which was illegal, or murder, which was also illegal, though increasingly tempting. He was considering and rejecting various half-formed plans when George Ridgway appeared leading his horse. The older man's face showed no surprise at finding Bridger still in town, just weary resignation. Heard you had excitement last night, Ridgway said. News travels fast. Always does in small towns. Ridgway tied his horse and came to sit beside. Bridger, how bad did you hurt him? Concussion, maybe, some bruised ribs, nothing permanent. Shame. The word hung between them, and Bridger glanced at Ridgway with a new assessment. The cattleman's weathered face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held something cold and hard. You don't like Elliot Garrett much, Bridger observed. Nobody likes Elliot. He's a drunk and a bully and a coward. Ridgway pulled out his pipe and tobacco, but I knew his father and I know that old man would be sick to see what his son became. He packed the pipe with deliberate movements also. I've got a daughter about Maggie's age who lives back east with her mother, and I can't help thinking if some bastard treated my girl the way Elliot treats his wife, I'd want someone to do something about it. But you haven't done anything. What can I do? Ridgway's voice carried genuine frustration. I'm not the law, and even if I was, the law protects men like Elliot. I could punch him, I suppose, and I'd feel better for about 5 minutes until he pressed charges and I ended up in jail or dead. He lit the pipe and smoke wreathed his head, or I could kill him outright, which would definitely solve Maggie's problem, right up until they hanged me for murder. So we do nothing. We do nothing effective. Ridgway met Bridger's gaze. But maybe you could do something I can't. What do you mean? You're a stranger here. You've got no property, no reputation, no ties to this town. Ridgway spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. If you did something drastic, something that got Maggie away from Elliot, nobody here would mourn losing you, and the law might not try too hard to track down a drifting gambler who disappeared into the territory. You're suggesting I kidnap her. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just observing that a man with nothing to lose has more options than those of us who built lives here. Bridger considered this. And if Garrett came after us, then you'd have to deal with him permanent-like. Ridgway's expression was hard, and in dealing with him, you'd be doing this town a service, whether anyone admits it or not. That's murder. That's frontier justice. And there's a difference. Ridgway stood and brushed ash from his pipe. Elliot Garrett is a cancer in this community. He's cruel to his wife. He cheats at cards. He owes money all over town, and he's driving away decent people who don't want to live in a place where men like him can do whatever they want. Someone removing him wouldn't be a crime. It would be surgery. The casual way Ridgway discussed killing a man should have shocked Bridger, but it didn't. He'd been in the territory long enough to understand that official law and practical justice often diverged, especially in places where the nearest federal marshal was 3 days' ride away. Men like Ridgway played poker and drank whiskey with men they knew were killers and thieves because that was simply how things worked when civilization was still more aspiration than reality. I'll think about it, Bridger said finally. Don't think too long. Ridgway untied his horse. You've got maybe 12 hours before Turner and the Dobbs brothers come looking for you, and when they do, they won't be alone. He swung into the saddle. And whatever you decide, I didn't have this conversation with you, and I don't know anything about your plans. Understood. Ridgway rode off, and Bridger was alone again with his thoughts and the growing certainty that he was going to do something spectacularly stupid. He spent the next hour checking his weapons and supplies. The pistol was clean and loaded. The knife in his boot had a good edge. He had perhaps $200 left from his winnings at the Red Queen, enough to get 2 people to California, if they were careful and didn't mind hardship. Around mid-morning, Harlan Moss arrived. The big man looked like he hadn't slept much either, and his normally jovial expression was replaced by something darker. "Need to talk to you," Moss said without preamble. They moved to the back of the stable where they couldn't be overheard. Moss leaned against a support beam and crossed his massive arms. "Elliot came to see me this morning," he said. "Wants me to ban you from the Red Queen, claims you're a cheat and a troublemaker." "What did you tell him?" "Told him my saloon serves whoever I want, and I don't take orders from drunk fools." Moss paused, "But I also told him that if you caused any more trouble on my property, I'd throw you out myself. And I meant it. I've got a business to run, and having gunfights in my establishment is bad for trade." "Fair enough. That's not why I'm here, though." Moss shifted his weight. "The real reason is Maggie Garrett came to see me too, asked me to give you a message." "What message?" "That you need to leave today before sunset." Moss's expression was troubled. "She was pretty emphatic about it. Said Elliot's planning something bad and she doesn't want your death on her conscience." "Did she say what he's planning?" "No, but she was really scared, and Maggie doesn't scare easy." Moss leaned forward. "I've known her since she came to Sweetwater, and I've watched that bastard break her down piece by piece for 4 years. She's asking you to leave, which means she thinks whatever's coming tonight is bad enough that you won't survive it. Or she's trying to protect me," Bridger said. "Maybe." Moss studied him. "But why would she do that unless she thinks you're worth protecting?" The implications sat between them. Bridger thought about Margaret's face when she'd thanked him for refusing her husband's wager. Thought about the note she'd written warning him about Turner and the Dobbs brothers. Thought about the way she'd told him to leave last night with resignation in her voice, but something else too. Something that might have been hope. "Tell me something," Bridger said. "Does Elliot have debts?" "Debts?" Moss looked surprised by the question. "Hell yes, he owes money all over town." "Why? How much?" "No idea exactly, but it's substantial." Moss thought for a moment. "I know he owes me about $300 for bar tabs he hasn't paid, and I heard he owes another $500 to the bank for a loan he took out last winter. Probably owes money to half the merchants in Sweetwater, plus gambling debts to various people who played cards with him. So if someone paid off his debts in exchange for something, like what? Like a deed to his property." Bridger spoke slowly, working through the idea as he articulated it. "If someone offered to clear his debts completely in exchange for a quitclaim deed to his house and land, would he take it?" Moss's eyes widened. "You're thinking of buying the house out from under him?" "I'm thinking of giving him a way out that doesn't involve violence." Bridger started pacing. "If I could gather enough creditors and get them to agree to forgive his debts in exchange for the property, then Elliot would be free of his financial burden, and Margaret would be free of him." "That's insane," Moss said, but his tone suggested he was intrigued by the insanity. "And even if you could pull it off, why would Elliot agree? He'd lose everything. He's already lost everything, he just hasn't admitted it yet." Bridger turned to face Moss. "And if the alternative is jail time for attempted murder or worse, he might see signing over a worthless property as the better option. You'd need leverage, though, something to force his hand." "I know." Bridger smiled without humor. "That's where things get complicated." They spent the next hour planning. Moss knew everyone in Sweetwater who Garrett owed money to and roughly how much. He also knew which creditors might be willing to participate in an unorthodox debt settlement, and which ones would demand cash regardless. By the time they finished, Bridger had a list of names and amounts that added up to just over $1,500. It was more than he had, but not by much. If he threw in his horse and gear and the last of his winnings, he could probably cover it. The question was whether the plan would work and whether he'd live long enough to implement it. Moss left to start making discreet inquiries among the creditors, and Bridger sat alone planning the details. He needed to approach Garrett with the offer in a way that made accepting it seemed like winning rather than losing. He needed to have all the creditors lined up before making his move, and he needed to do all of it before sunset, when Turner and the Dobbs brothers would come looking for blood. It was audacious, bordering on suicidal, but it was the only plan he had that didn't end with someone dead. Around noon, Peter Caldwell returned with another message. "Margaret wants to see you," he said quietly. "She's at the church." The church was a small, whitewashed building at the east end of town with with a simple cross above the door and narrow windows of plain glass. Bridger found Margaret sitting in the last pew with her hands folded in her lap and her head bowed. She wore a high-collared dress that covered her throat and a bonnet that shadowed her bruised face. She looked up when he entered, and he saw that one eye was swollen nearly shut and her lip had scabbed over. She'd been crying recently. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice hoarse. "You asked for me. I asked you to leave Sweetwater." She stood slowly, as if movement hurt. "I sent word to warn you about tonight because you've shown me kindness, and I don't want your death on my conscience, but I can't protect you if you won't protect yourself." "I'm not leaving," Bridger said. "Not yet, anyway." "Why not?" Frustration cracked through her exhaustion. "What possible reason do you have to stay?" "You said simply." Margaret stared at him, and something complicated passed across her face. Confusion maybe, or disbelief, or the painful stirring of hope in a place where hope had long been dead. She shook her head slowly. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough." Bridger stepped closer, but not close enough to crowd her. "I know you're strong and decent and trapped in a situation you don't deserve. I know your husband is a coward who takes his failures out on you because he can't face them himself. And I know that if I ride away from here and leave you with him, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. That's not your burden to carry. Maybe not, but I'm carrying it anyway." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I have a plan. It's risky, and it might not work, but if it does, you'll be free of him." "What kind of plan?" he told her. She listened without interrupting, and as he spoke, her expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest, to something that might have been belief. When he finished, she sat heavily on the pew and stared at the simple altar. "That's impossible," she said finally. "You can't possibly gather that much money. And even if you could, why would Elliot agree to sign over the house?" "Because I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse," Bridger said. "And because deep down, he knows he's already beaten. This way, he gets to pretend it was his choice." Margaret looked up at him. "And what do you get out of this?" she asked. "Nothing," Bridger said, "except the satisfaction of knowing you're safe." She studied his face, searching for deception or hidden motive. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "What do you need me to do?" The afternoon sun beat down on Sweetwater with relentless intensity, as if determined to bake every secret and lie out of the dusty streets. Bridger moved through town with purpose, visiting each creditor on the list Moss had provided, and presenting his proposition with the careful persuasion of a man who'd spent years reading people and understanding what motivated them. Some required only the promise of partial payment. Others needed assurance that Elliot Garrett would face consequences for his unpaid debts. A few demanded to know why a stranger cared enough to involve himself in local affairs, and Bridger gave them the only answer that mattered because someone had to. By 3 o'clock, he'd secured agreements from 11 creditors representing nearly $1,300 in outstanding debts. The bank manager, a thin, nervous man named Hutchins, proved the hardest to convince, but eventually agreed when Bridger pointed out that foreclosing on the Garrett property would likely yield less than the $500 owed given the house's deteriorating condition and the depressed land values in the area. Better to accept a settlement and be done with it. The final piece fell into place when Doc Morrison, the town's aging physician, appeared at the livery with his medical bag and a grim expression. "Heard you're putting together something interesting," he said without preamble. "Elliot owes me $200 for services rendered to his wife over the past 2 years, setting broken bones mostly and treating various injuries he claimed were accidents." "They weren't accidents," Bridger said. "I know." Morrison's weathered face hardened. "I've been a doctor for 30 years, and I can tell the difference between a woman who fell downstairs and one who was pushed. The problem is proving it and getting anyone to care. You're the last creditor I needed." Bridger said, "If you're willing to forgive the debt in exchange for a quit-claim deed to property you'll never actually own, then I can make this work." Morrison smiled coldly. "I'll forgive every penny," he said, "and I'll do it with pleasure, because watching Elliot Garrett lose everything might be the best medicine I've prescribed in years." With all the creditors secured, Bridger returned to the church, where Margaret waited. She'd been there all afternoon, having nowhere else to go that was safe, and when he entered she rose quickly, searching his face for news. "It's done?" He said I have commitments from everyone he owes money to. Now comes the hard part. Confronting Elliot? Yes. Bridger moved to sit beside her, keeping a respectful distance. The creditors will gather at the Red Queen at 6 o'clock. Moss is spreading word that there's going to be a meeting about Garrett's debts and that anyone interested should attend. Elliot will hear about it and he'll come because his pride won't let him hide. And then I make him an offer in front of witnesses. Bridger met her eyes. Either he signs over the property and walks away with his debts cleared, or the creditors will pursue legal action that will take everything anyway and probably land him in jail. This way, he gets to choose the manner of his defeat. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. What happens to me? She asked finally. After he signs the deed, where do I go? Anywhere you want. Bridger pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket. This is everything I have left, about $200. It's enough to get you to California or back east to start over somewhere Elliot can't find you. She stared at the pouch but didn't take it. You're giving me everything. I don't need it where I'm going. And where's that? Bridger smiled without humor. Probably 6 feet under if Jake Turner has his way, but at least I'll go knowing I did something that mattered. Don't. Margaret's hand shot out and gripped his wrist. Her warm and urgent, don't talk like that. You're risking everything for me, and I don't even know why. Because no one else would, Bridger said quietly. And because you deserve better than what you've gotten. He turned his hand to clasp hers briefly, then released it. Now, I need you to promise me something. What? If this goes wrong tonight, if Garrett doesn't accept the deal, or if things turn violent, I need you to take that money and run. Don't wait to see how it ends. Don't try to help. Just go and don't look back. I can't just abandon you. Yes, you can. His voice was firm. You have spent 4 years trapped in a nightmare, and this is your chance to wake up. Don't waste it trying to save someone who knew what he was getting into. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. You're a good man, Thomas Bridger, she said. I'm really not, he replied, but maybe I can do one good thing before I run out of chances. They sat together in the quiet church until shadows began to lengthen, and the quality of light shifted from harsh to golden. Outside, the sounds of evening began with dogs barking and children being called home, and somewhere the first notes of that off-key piano drifting from the Red Queen. It was time. Bridger stood and offered his hand to help Margaret rise. She took it and held on a moment longer than necessary. Whatever happens, she said, thank you for seeing me as a person instead of property. That shouldn't be something you have to thank someone for, he said, but you're welcome all the same. They walked to the Red Queen together, though Margaret hung back in the doorway while Bridger entered. The saloon was already crowded with more people than he'd seen there before. The creditors occupied tables near the back, their faces showing various degrees of anticipation and skepticism. George Ridgway sat with Doc Morrison, both men nursing whiskies and watching the room with careful attention. Harlan Moss stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with studied nonchalance, but his shotgun rested within easy reach. And at a table near the center sat Elliot Garrett, flanked by Jake Turner and the Dobbs brothers. Garrett's face was pale and drawn with dark circles under his eyes, and a bandage wrapped around his head where he'd struck the wall the previous night. But his eyes burned with fever-bright intensity, and his hands trembled slightly as he lifted a whiskey glass to his lips. Turner saw Bridger first. His hand dropped to his gun, but Moss's voice cut across the room. No weapons, gentlemen. This is a business meeting, not a shootout. Anyone who draws iron gets both barrels of buckshot, and I don't miss at this range. Turner's hand moved away from his gun, but his pale eyes promised violence, delayed, not forgotten. Bridger ignored him and walked to the center of the room where everyone could see him. Thank you all for coming, he said, his voice carrying clearly. I know this is unusual, but I promise not to waste your time. What the hell is this about? Garrett demanded, rising unsteadily to his feet. It's about your debts, Elliot. Bridger gestured to the assembled creditors. You owe money to most of the people in this room, and you've been dodging payment for months. They're tired of waiting. So what? Garrett's voice rose belligerent. They can wait a little longer. I'm good for it. No, you're not. Bridger pulled out the list Moss had prepared, and you owe Harlan Moss $300. You owe First Bank of Sweetwater $500. You owe Doc Morrison $200 for medical services. The list goes on 15 creditors, total nearly $1,500. in outstanding debts. The room was silent now, every eye fixed on Garrett, whose face had gone from pale to flushed. "That's a lie," he said. "Is it?" Bridger turned to Moss, who nodded confirmation, then to Hutchins, the bank manager, who consulted a ledger and nodded as well. "The numbers are documented. Elliot and everyone here knows it. So what do you want me to do? I don't have $1,500. "I know." Bridger's voice was calm and reasonable, "which is why I'm here to make you an offer on behalf of your creditors." "What kind of offer?" "A settlement." Bridger moved closer. "You sign over the deed to your house and property clean and clear with no encumbrances. In exchange, every creditor in this room agrees to forgive your debts completely. You walk away with nothing but also owing nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. Garrett stared at Bridger as if he'd started speaking a foreign language. Then understanding dawned, and with it came rage. "You want my house?" he hissed. "You want to take everything my father built? Your father built a legacy and you've been pissing it away at card tables for 5 years. Bridger's voice hardened. "What I'm offering is mercy. You sign the deed, you're free of debt, free to leave Sweetwater and start somewhere fresh. You refuse, and these creditors will pursue legal action that will take the property anyway and probably put you in jail for fraud. This is insane." Garrett turned to the assembled crowd. "You're not actually considering. This drifter, this stranger, comes to town, and suddenly you're all willing to steal my property." "Nobody's stealing anything," Hutchins said quietly. "We're offering a legal settlement of legitimate debts. The alternative is foreclosure and litigation, which benefits no one." "He's right, Elliot." George Ridgway stood, his voice carrying the weight of years and authority. "You're broke, and everyone knows it. Take the deal while it's on the table, because tomorrow it might not be." Garrett's eyes swept the room, looking for support for someone who'd take his side. But every face he saw showed either indifference or satisfaction at his downfall. The town he'd tried to dominate through money and intimidation had turned on him. His gaze finally landed on Jake. "Turner, do something," he said. Turner looked at Garrett, then at the room full of armed men, then back at Garrett. He stood slowly, and the Dobbs brothers rose with him. "This ain't my fight, Elliot," he said. "You got yourself into this mess, and you can get yourself out. Come on, boys." The 3 men walked out of the Red Queen without looking back. Garrett watched them go, and something broke in his face, the last remnants of his pride crumbling into dust. "I won't do it," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't make me sign." "You're right, I can't." Bridger pulled out a prepared quitclaim deed and set it on the table, along with a pen and ink. "But consider what happens if you don't. The bank forecloses, which takes months, during which you can't sell or mortgage the property. The other creditors file suit, which costs money you don't have for lawyers. Eventually you lose everything anyway, plus you'll have a judgment against you that follows you wherever you go." He paused. "Or you sign now, walk out of here a free man, and never have to think about Sweetwater again." Garrett stared at the document. His hands shook and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cooling evening air. Around him, the silence was heavy with anticipation. "Where would I go?" he asked finally, and his voice was small, almost childlike. "Anywhere but here," Doc Morrison said, "and good riddance." That seemed to decide it. Garrett reached for the pen with a hand that trembled so badly he nearly knocked over the inkwell. He stared at the deed for a long moment, then bent and signed his name in a barely legible scrawl. When he finished, he straightened and looked at Bridger with naked hatred. "I hope you're satisfied," he said. Bridger replied quietly, "But at least one person will be free." Garrett opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to collapse in on himself. He turned and walked toward the door, moving like a man decades older than his years. At the threshold, he paused and looked back one final time. "She was never worth it," he said. "You'll figure that out soon enough." Then he was gone. The room erupted in conversation as the creditors surged forward to examine the signed deed. Hutchins verified the signature and pronounced it legally binding. Moss produced a bottle of good whiskey and began pouring drinks for everyone. Men clapped Bridger on the back and thanked him for solving a problem that had plagued the town for years. But Bridger wasn't paying attention to any of it. His eyes had found Margaret still standing in the doorway, and the expression on her face was complicated joy and relief and disbelief, all tangled together. He moved through the crowd toward her, and when he reached her, she was crying silently, tears streaming down her bruised face. "It's done," he said. "You're free." She nodded, unable to speak. Then she did something that surprised them both. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. Bridger stood frozen for a moment, then slowly, carefully returned the embrace. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Over her head, Bridger saw George Ridgway, watching them with an expression of satisfaction. The old cattleman raised his whiskey glass in silent salute, and Bridger nodded acknowledgement. Behind him, Doc Morrison was already preparing to record the deed transfer, making it official and irrevocable. The plan had worked. Against all odds and common sense, the gambler's final hand had paid off, not with money, but with something infinitely more valuable. Margaret pulled back and looked up at him. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Bridger said, "you take that money and you go somewhere safe. San Francisco maybe, or Denver, or back east if you prefer. You find work teaching or whatever else you want to do, and you build a life that belongs to you and no one else. What about you?" "I'll move on like I always do." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "The mayor needs rest, and I need distance between me and this place before Garrett decides to come back with friends. You saved my life." She said, "The least I can do is share the road for a while." "Margaret, please." Her eyes were earnest pleading. "I have nowhere to go and no one to go with, and the thought of traveling alone terrifies me. Just to the next town, or the next territory until I find my footing." Bridger hesitated. Every instinct told him that traveling together would complicate things, would create attachments he couldn't afford. But looking at her face, still marked by violence but showing the first signs of hope, he couldn't bring himself to refuse. "All right," he said, "to the next town." She smiled, then really smiled, and it transformed her face, making her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with light returning to places that had been dark too long. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of fire, and the evening air carried the promise of cooler temperatures ahead. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Elliot Garrett was packing what few possessions he still claimed and preparing to leave the only home he'd ever known. And in the Red Queen, a room full of men celebrated the resolution of a problem that had festered too long. But Bridger's mind was already on tomorrow, on supplies they'd need, and routes they'd take, and the careful distance he'd have to maintain to protect them both from complications. He'd done what he set out to do, which meant it was time to move on. The only question was whether moving on would be easier or harder with the company. He suspected he already knew the answer. The pre-dawn darkness held Sweetwater in a grip so complete it seemed the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what the new day would bring. Bridger stood in the livery yard with his mare already saddled and his few possessions secured in the saddlebags. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere a rooster crowed, announcing the coming sunrise, though the eastern sky showed only the faintest lightening along the horizon. Margaret appeared from the darkness, moving quietly, as if afraid to disturb the silence. She wore traveling clothes, a simple dark skirt and jacket that Bridger recognized as borrowed from someone in town, probably one of the few women who'd shown her kindness over the years. A small carpet bag held everything she owned now, which wasn't much. Her face was still bruised, but the swelling had gone down, and her eyes showed determination rather than fear. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Bridger helped her mount the mare, then swung up behind her. The horse shifted under the double weight, but settled quickly. She was a strong animal bred for endurance, and carrying two people wouldn't tax her as long as they kept to a reasonable pace and rested frequently. They'd need to buy a second horse in the next town, but for now this would have to suffice. They rode out of Sweetwater, heading west toward the open territory, where the land stretched endless, and the law was whatever men with guns decided it should be. Behind them, the town slowly came to life, as merchants opened shops and children emerged for morning chores, and the rhythm of ordinary existence continued, as if nothing nothing significant had occurred. In a week, Sweetwater would have mostly forgotten the gambler who'd stayed too long and the woman who'd finally escaped. In a month, their story would be just another tale told over whiskey in the Red Queen, embellished and distorted until truth and fiction became indistinguishable. But for now, they rode in silence, with the dawn breaking around them in shades of gold and rose, and the future spreading before them uncertain but no longer predetermined. They made good time through the morning, stopping once to water the mare at a creek and let Margaret stretch her legs. She walked along the bank while Bridger checked the horse's shoes and scanned the horizon for signs of pursuit. He didn't expect Garrett to follow, at least not immediately, but men like Jake Turner held grudges, and the Dobbs brothers might decide there was profit in revenge. Better to assume danger and be pleasantly surprised than the opposite. "It's beautiful out here," Margaret said, rejoining him. She gestured at the rolling grassland, dotted with mesquite and the distant mountains purple against the sky. "I spent 4 years in Sweetwater and barely saw any of it. Elliot didn't like me going far from the house." "Well, now you can go anywhere you want," Bridger said. She looked at him, then really looked as if trying to understand who he was beneath the weather-beaten exterior and careful reserve. "Why did you do it?" She asked the question she'd been holding since the previous night. "You could have left Sweetwater with your winnings and never looked back. Why risk everything for someone you barely know?" Bridger was quiet for a moment, checking the cinch on the saddle, even though it didn't need checking. Finally he spoke without meeting her eyes. "I was married once," he said, "long time ago, back before the war. She was young and I was foolish, and we thought love was enough to overcome anything." He paused, the memories sharp, despite the years. "Her father didn't approve, thought I was too wild, too unreliable. Turned out he was right. I left to scout for the army I promised I'd send for her once I got established. What happened? I got established eventually, but by then she'd married someone else. A banker, steady, respected, everything I wasn't." Bridger finally looked at Margaret. "I heard later that he hit her, that he controlled every aspect of her life, and that she was miserable. And I thought if I'd just been better, if I'd been the man she needed, maybe she wouldn't have ended up trapped. So you saved me to make up for not saving her?" "Maybe," Bridger shrugged. "Or maybe I saved you because someone should have saved her and didn't. Either way, it needed doing, and I was there to do it." Margaret stepped closer and placed her hand on his arm. "What was her name?" she asked softly. "Elizabeth." Saying it aloud felt strange after so many years of not speaking it. "Elizabeth Thorne, before she married Elizabeth Camden, after. Where is she now?" "Dead. Influenza took her 3 winters ago." Bridger's voice was flat, affecting the emotionless tone of a man reporting facts rather than tragedies. "Her husband outlived her by 6 months before drinking himself into the grave. No children. Nothing left of either of them except some land nobody wanted and debts nobody could collect." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and meant it. "Don't be. It was a long time ago, and I made my peace with it." He turned to face her directly. "But when I saw you in that church yesterday asking me to leave so I wouldn't get hurt, I saw Elizabeth in you. That same strength hiding behind resignation. That same belief that you deserved what you got because you'd made bad choices. And I thought, not this time. This time someone walks away free." They stood looking at each other while the creek burbled past and the mare grazed on tough grass, and overhead a hawk circled lazy and unconcerned with human drama. Then Margaret rose on her toes and kissed him briefly on the lips before stepping back. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me, and for everything else." Bridger touched his lips, surprised. Margaret smiled and returned to the creek bank, leaving him to process what had just happened and what it might mean. They rode on through the afternoon as the sun climbed high and hot, and the landscape gradually shifted from grassland to rockier terrain dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. They passed a few travelers heading east, a freight wagon, and 2 cowboys driving a small herd, but nobody showed unusual interest in them. Just another pair of riders on the endless trails that crisscrossed the territory. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth remembering. Around mid-afternoon, they crested a rise and saw smoke rising in the distance. A town or settlement of some kind, perhaps large enough to have a stable where they could acquire a second horse. Bridger pointed it out to Margaret. "We'll stop there," he said. "Rest for the night and resupply. You can decide if you want to keep going west or head in a different direction. Margaret asked, "Where are you going?" "Haven't decided yet." He'd been moving for so long that the question of destination felt almost irrelevant. Maybe California, maybe Mexico, maybe just keep riding until I find a place that feels right. That sounds lonely. It is, Bridger admitted, but it's also simple. No attachments, no obligations. No one depending on you. "Is that really what you want?" she asked. "Or is it just what you've gotten used to?" He didn't answer because he wasn't sure himself anymore. The town was called Wilson's Crossing, and it was larger than Sweetwater, with actual streets and a proper hotel and a livery stable run by a competent-looking man with kind eyes. Bridger arranged for a stall and feed for the mare, then inquired about purchasing a second horse. The stable owner had a solid bay gelding for sale at a reasonable price, and Bridger paid with some of the money he'd held back from the debt settlement. Margaret watched the transaction with growing awareness of how much this was costing him. When they left the stable, she pulled him aside. "You're spending everything on me," she said. "I'm spending it on supplies and horses." "We both need," Bridger corrected, but his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. "Thomas," she waited until he looked at her. "You can't keep doing this. You can't keep giving everything away and pretending it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What am I going to do with money anyway? I've never needed much. Everyone needs something." Her voice was gentle but firm. "And right now, you need to stop punishing yourself for things that happened years ago." "I'm not." "Yes, you are." Margaret stepped closer. "You're trying to redeem yourself by saving me, but I'm not Elizabeth. And you're not the man who failed her. You're the man who succeeded with me, and that should count for something," Bridger said quietly. "It counts for everything." They took rooms at the hotel, 2 separate rooms at Margaret's insistence, though Bridger could see the fear in her eyes at being alone. Years of abuse had left scars deeper than bruises, and the prospect of sleeping in an unfamiliar place without protection clearly terrified her. But she was determined to do things properly to maintain respectability, even though they were hundreds of miles from anyone who knew them. Bridger respected that, even as he worried about her. They ate dinner together in the hotel dining room, simple fare but well prepared, and more than either of them had eaten in days. Over coffee, Margaret finally broached the question they'd both been avoiding. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "Do we keep traveling together, or do we part ways here?" "That depends on what," Bridger said. "I don't know what I want." She looked down at her cup. "I've spent so long being told what to want that I've forgotten how to decide for myself. All I know is that traveling with you feels safe, and the thought of traveling alone terrifies me. Safe is good, but it's not fair to you." Margaret met his eyes. "I can't be a burden to someone you have to protect and provide for. I need to learn to stand on my own." "You're not a burden," Bridger said, "and you're already standing on your own. Yesterday you walked away from everything you knew with nothing but a borrowed dress and a carpet bag. That takes more courage than most people have. Or maybe it just takes desperation. Maybe. But you're here and you're free, and that's what matters." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke carefully, as if testing words she wasn't sure she should say. "What if I don't want to just be free?" she said. "What if I want more than that?" "What do you mean?" "I mean," she paused, gathering courage. "I mean that you're a good man, Thomas Bridger, and being with you feels like the first right thing in my life in years. And I know it's too soon, and I know I'm probably just confused and grateful, but I also know that I don't want to say goodbye tomorrow." Bridger felt something shift in his chest, some carefully maintained wall beginning to crack. Margaret Garrett was offering him something he'd convinced himself he didn't want or deserve. A chance to stop running, to build something lasting, with someone who saw him clearly and chose him anyway. "It would be complicated," he said finally. "You're still legally married. Until a court says otherwise, people would talk. Let them talk." Margaret's voice was steady. "I've spent 4 years caring what people think, and it got me nothing but bruises. I'm done living for other people's approval." "And what about me?" Bridger asked. "What do I get out of this arrangement?" "You get someone who knows what you did for her and will never forget it." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You get someone who wants to know who you really are, not just the gambler or the drifter, but the man underneath." And maybe she smiled slightly, "When you get someone to share the road with, so it's not quite so lonely." Bridger looked at their joined hands and thought about Elizabeth, about the years he'd wasted wandering about, all the places he'd been, and none of them feeling like home. And he thought about the woman sitting across from him, who'd survived things that would have broken most people and still had the courage to reach out and take what she wanted. "All right," he said. "I'm in if you are." Margaret's smile was like the sunrise. "I'm in." They talked long into the night, making plans that were really more dreams than plans. They'd head to California, where the law was still forming, and people asked fewer questions about where you came from. Margaret would find teaching work. She had references from her time in Sweetwater that were still good. Bridger would find something honest, maybe ranch work or clerking in a store, something that didn't involve reading men for tells and taking their money at cards. They'd save until Margaret could file for divorce, claiming abandonment, which was legal grounds in California. And after that, well, after that they'd see. It was impractical and probably foolish, and built on a foundation of trauma and rescue rather than the slow, careful courtship that proper people expected. But it was also real and honest, and neither of them was interested in proper anymore. Near midnight, they said goodnight at Margaret's door. She hesitated, then kissed him again, longer this time, with more certainty. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me a future worth having." "Thank you," Bridger replied, "for reminding me that futures are possible." He returned to his own room and lay awake in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the hotel settling around him. Tomorrow they'd ride west towards something neither of them could quite name, but both of them desperately wanted. It wouldn't be easy. Margaret would have nightmares and moments of panic when the trauma caught up with her. Bridger would struggle with the domestic stability he'd spent years avoiding. They'd argue and doubt and wonder if they'd made the right choice. But they'd do it together, which made all the difference. The next morning it dawned clear and cool, with a breeze that smelled of possibility. Bridger woke early and went to check on the horses, finding them rested and ready. He was loading supplies onto the bay gelding when Margaret emerged from the hotel, wearing the same borrowed clothes, but somehow looking different. Her bruises were fading, and her eyes showed something he hadn't seen before: genuine happiness. "Ready?" he asked. She looked at him, at the horses, at the road leading west into territory they'd never seen. Then she smiled. "Ready," she said. They rode out of Wilson's Crossing side by side, as the sun climbed and the day warmed and the miles stretched before them, endless and full of promise. Behind them lay Sweetwater and Elliot Garrett and everything they'd been before. Ahead lay California and new names and lives built on choices rather than circumstances. Somewhere in the space between those 2 points, Thomas Bridger, the gambler who'd never stayed anywhere long, and Margaret Garrett, the woman who'd survived what shouldn't be survivable, found something neither had expected. Not love, exactly not yet, but the possibility of love. The foundation upon which love could be built if they were patient and honest and willing to do the work. And that possibility was enough. The Texas plains rolled past beneath the horses' hooves, and overhead the sky stretched blue and infinite. They didn't talk much as they rode. There was no need. Sometimes silence between two people meant absence, and sometimes it meant presence so complete that words would only diminish it. This was the second kind. Hours later, when they stopped to rest and water the horses, Margaret stood looking back the way they'd come. Bridger joined her, following her gaze to the empty horizon. "Any regrets?" he asked. "None," Margaret said, then turned to look at him. "Maybe one." "What's that?" "That we didn't meet sooner under better circumstances." "If we'd met sooner," Bridger said, "I would have just been a gambler passing through. I wouldn't have stayed. I wouldn't have cared enough to stay. And now I care." He met her eyes, and maybe that's what had to happen for both of us. We had to go through hell to find each other on the other side. "That's a terrible romantic philosophy," she said, but smiled to show she didn't entirely disagree. "I'm a gambler, not a poet. You're more than that." Margaret took his hand. "You're the man who tore up the deed to his own future and gave it away for someone else's freedom." Bridger looked puzzled. "I didn't tear up any deed?" "Yes, you did." She squeezed his hand, the old Thomas Bridger, the drifter who never stayed, who never cared, who kept moving because stopping meant feeling. "You tore up that version of yourself when you decided to stay in Sweetwater. And what you gave me wasn't just freedom from Elliot, it was the possibility of a future I never thought I'd have." He was quiet, absorbing this. Then he smiled slightly. "Guess that makes us even then," he said, "because you gave me the same thing." They mounted again and continued west. The afternoon stretched long and golden, and somewhere ahead lay the first night of many they'd spend together. There would be challenges ahead, legal complications and social judgments, and the simple difficulty of two damaged people learning to trust each other. But those were tomorrow's problems. Today they rode toward California, toward the kind of a future that people built one careful choice at a time when they finally stopped running from their pasts and started walking towards something better. Behind them, Sweetwater receded into memory. Behind them, Elliot Garrett packed his remaining possessions and pointed himself toward New Orleans, where no one knew his name. Behind them, Jake Turner and the Dobbs brothers found other employment and other victims, because men like that always did. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the road ahead and the woman riding beside him, and the quiet understanding that sometimes salvation comes not from being rescued, but from finding someone worth rescuing yourself for. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. In the distance, a town flickered into view, just a few lights against the gathering darkness. They'd reach it before full night and find a place to stay, and tomorrow they'd ride on. And the day after that, they'd ride on again. And eventually, somewhere down that endless road, they'd find home, not a place, but a feeling. The feeling of belonging to yourself first, and then to someone who valued that belonging rather than trying to own it. Thomas Bridger had spent 7 years scouting hostile territory, and another 6 drifting from town to town, always moving, never settling. He'd thought that was freedom, the ability to leave whenever things got complicated. But riding west with Margaret beside him, he understood finally that real freedom wasn't the absence of attachment. It was choosing your attachments wisely and then having the courage to honor them. The road stretched endlessly before them, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Bridger wasn't in a hurry to reach the end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.